We have this evening with us a couple of national authorities on the subject of life imprisonment. Both work at the Sentencing Project, a DC-based research and advocacy center that focuses on reducing the use of incarceration and addresses racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Marc, who started working on criminal justice issues more than 40 years ago, joined the Sentencing Project in 1987, a year after it was established, and has been the group's executive director since 2005. Ashley Nellis, who holds a doctorate from American University, is a senior research analyst at the Sentencing Project. Together, Marc and Ashley have written The Meaning of Life, the Case for Abolishing Life Sentences. The book makes a well-researched and thoughtful case for eliminating a penalty that's been imposed on more than 200,000 people currently imprisoned in the United States, about 1 of every 7 inmates. They argue that life imprisonment is ineffective and costly, violates legal and human rights norms, disproportionately affects marginalized people, and doesn't meaningfully increase public safety. Moreover, they contend it places the United States at odds with a number of other nations and casts a stain on our democracy. Woven throughout the book are profiles of 6 people affected by life sentences, written by a former lifer, Kerry Myers, who himself served 27 years of what was to have been a life sentence for a crime he maintains he did not commit. Now, Kerry's own case is noteworthy. Convicted of fatally beating his wife, he ended up in a state penitentiary in Louisiana, where he went on to become editor of an award-winning prison magazine before the governor eventually freed him amid a groundswell of national support. Marc and Ashley also put forward a reform program that includes capping prison terms at 20 years and establishing more helpful services that would ensure convicts are better equipped to re-enter society after being in jail. This whole issue, of course, is complex and controversial, part of the larger debate underway in this country now about mass incarceration. But readers on both sides of the argument will find in Marc and Ashley's book much information that is useful and very much worth thinking about. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me now in welcoming both Marc and Ashley.
Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see everyone here. Thanks so much to Politics and Prose, as always, for being such a wonderful bookstore and hosting us. I was recalling, I've been here several times on different books. The first time was almost exactly 20 years ago. My book, Race to Incarcerate, came out. At the time, an organization I belonged to was very excited I was going to be coming here. So they put a notice in their newsletter and said, Marc Mao will be speaking about his new book, Race to Incinerate, at Politics and Prose. So we had a very varied crowd. And just so there's no disappointment here, some of you may have come because you want us to help you discover the meaning of life, but we can't help you with that. But we can tell you something about life imprisonment. So here's how we want to do the program. I'm going to say a few words of introduction about the issue. Then Ashley's going to speak a bit about trends and policies that have produced the current situation. Discussion. So the big story 100 years. 100 years ago, there was a man named within a few years. He was working as a pimp in Alaska. At the age of 18, he killed a bartender who had not paid for the services of a prostitute, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. His first few years in prison, a number of occasions, he got into fights, attacked other prisoners, sometimes very severely, and then several years later, in a cafeteria with 1,000 people in the dining hall, he fatally stabbed a prison guard who he said had interfered with a visit from his brother. Now, my guess is very few of you know the name Robert Stroud, but many more of you probably know the movie that was made about him, The Birdman of Alcatraz, 1960, starring Burt Lancaster. Not long after Stroud was sentenced to death for his second homicide, one day there was a ill canary out there. He brought the bird into his prison cell, nursed it back to health, observed how it functioned, what kinds of responses it had. And over a period of years, with the assistance of a very sympathetic warden who made another prison cell available to him, he had over 300 birds come through his prison cell, observing just how they did their bodily functions, what their lives were like, and how you could deal with ailing birds. He became one of the noted authorities on bird behavior. He published 2 books while he was in prison, many journal articles, was considered a leading authority. And what's, I think, most important from our perspective is if you look back to the day of sentencing on his first conviction for murder, the day of sentencing for his second murder conviction, there was no one in the courtroom, judge, jury, prosecutor, defense, no one who could have possibly imagined the personal transformation he would have gone through over a period of dozens of years in prison. And if we're sentencing people based on what they just did today, there's no way of incorporating that possibility of personal transformation. And there's actually a great deal of criminological research that tells us a lot about that transformation. We'll speak about that a bit. So we want to keep that in mind. As Brad said at the outset, we're now at a point in the United States, our system of mass incarceration, where 1 of every 7 people in prison today is serving a life sentence, 206,000 people, as is true of our position in mass incarceration, use of the death penalty. The U.S. is at one extreme among industrialized nations in just how punitive a system that we have. And so that's why we undertook this book. That's the arguments that we want to make. And let me turn it over to Ashley for some of the background on how we got here.
Thanks, Mark. And I assume this is on and you all can hear me. I wanted to talk with you all about sort of setting the landscape of the population we're talking about when we talk about people serving life sentences. So as Mark mentioned, 1 in 7 people in prison is serving a life sentence in the United States. This means that it's somebody who is serving a life, what's called life with the possibility of parole, life without any possibility of parole, or a sentence that is 50 years or longer, a sentence where they're expected to die in prison. And we at the Sentencing Project have been documenting the expansion of life sentences since 2003. The first recorded official data that we're aware of comes from data that was in 1984. And if you look at the data from 1984 and compare it to 2016, which is the most recent data that we have, there's been a nearly 5-fold increase in the number of life with and life without parole sentences. And if you add to this the virtual lifers, the 50 years and more people, we have 206,000 people, 1 in 7 people in prison today serving a life sentence. So that's about 14% of the United States prison population is serving life. that it should be surprising to everyone here. Compared with other countries, we stand out, not unusually for our criminal justice system. So we're about 4% of the world's population and 40% of the population of life sentences around the world. Even here in the United States, we stand out when you consider the fact that we have what's sort of a household term now, recognized term of mass incarceration. Most Americans are at least aware that we have a structure of mass incarceration in place and that it is unsustainable, either on moral or fiscal grounds or some other grounds. And when you look at the pace of growth of incarceration over, let's say, the same period of time, 1984 to 2016, the pace of lifers' growth even is faster than that. So it's really, it's outpaced even mass incarceration. So our, one of our big concerns in this book is getting the point across that if we are to truly address mass incarceration, we're going to have to think about the lifer population. It is not going to be a success if we sort of tinker around the edges of our prison population and just focus on those that are in the low-level, nonviolent category, although those certainly need to be addressed as well. We're going to have to dig deeper into the system and consider new approaches for people serving time for very serious crimes. All states in the U.S. and the federal system have life imprisonment, and all states use it by some form or another. In some states, it's a relatively small proportion, but in the largest proportion states, 30% of the prison population is serving a life sentence. So in states like Utah and California, 30% of the prisoners there are serving a life sentence. Somewhat, similar to the criminal justice system more broadly, there's a lot of racial disparity among lifers. So 1 in 5 Black prisoners is serving a life sentence today. In terms of gender, most of the lifers certainly are male, but about 3% are female. And what's important about that is that, similar to the general prison population, the rate of growth for women lifers is outpacing the rate of growth for male, even though it's a relatively small number. So, it's important to see how did we get here, right? And we got here by the same policies that we've been talking about, more broadly as we consider mass incarceration and how we got to that. So, policies like habitual offender laws, 3 strikes laws, right? Laws that put you in prison for the rest of your life by the time you've made your 3rd big mistake. Sometimes by the time you've made your 2nd big mistake. We decide that you're too much of a danger to society and out you go, throw away the key. Also, a big player in life sentencing is the presence of mandatory minimums. Became very popular in the 1980s. This is the idea that you have to serve a mandatory term of imprisonment before you're even considered for release. A third sort of driver of life sentences has been the abolishment of parole altogether. So in almost a dozen states and also the federal system, they've gotten rid of the parole system completely. So every lifer is there for the rest of their life, and there's no way out, with the rare exception of an executive clemency. And then sort of the fourth topic that we talk about in terms of a driver of life sentences is what's called juvenile transfer. So this is the idea that people under the age of 18, when they commit their crime, can be automatically placed into the adult system, either because of the prosecutor deciding that they're going to be prosecuted in the adult system, or because of the nature of their crime. So in almost every state, if you're charged with committing a homicide, there's a possibility you'll be convicted and tried in the adult criminal justice system. The issue with this policy, one of the many issues with the policy, the transfer policy that also became very popular in the 1980s, is that it didn't consider the fact that states also had imposed these mandatory minimum statutes. And so they sort of converged such that lifers who had been tried as adults now were facing life sentences with no possibility of parole on a mandatory sentencing scheme. So today we have about 12,000 people who are under the age of 18 when they committed their crime. We hear about some of them, the 2,000 or so of them, who have gotten some relief through the Supreme Court rulings, but the vast majority have gotten no relief. And one person was in the news a lot today, if you follow Tennessee news, or it really became national news, Centoya Brown. So I just kind of want to end my little segment here talking about Centoya. So Centoya was 16 years old when she committed her homicide. She was a sex trafficking victim. Throughout her trial, she was referred to as a prostitute. Today, we're more evolved to understand that when you're 16, you really can't be a prostitute. You're a sex traffic victim, and she was forced into the trade. And one particular night, she felt particularly worried that her customer was going to kill her, and she killed him instead. She ended up with a life with parole sentence in the state of Tennessee at the age of 16. The thing about Tennessee, which is especially tragic, is that it has the longest mandatory minimum on a life term. So she had a minimum time served of 51 years before she would become eligible for release. She did fight, tooth and nail, like many lifers do, to get out. And she managed to get the attention of a number of celebrities and legal teams. And just today it was announced that Governor Haslam granted her a commutation, and she is going to be getting out in August. The one sort of parting comment about her is that it's a victory, absolutely, for her. But there are 182 people who have her exact same sentence, who were juveniles at the time of the crime, and they will remain in prison probably much farther past August 7th. So that is sort of the impetus for our work, is to focus on that group.
Okay, so the numbers are huge, and the numbers are very significant in their implications these days. But some people would argue, certainly, these people commit very serious crimes, generally violent crimes. Why should we be talking about any kind of leniency for them or change or things like that? So, and there's a lot to be said in that argument. For a start, though, there are some 17,000 people serving life sentence who are there for a nonviolent crime, a drug crime, a property crime. During President Obama's last 2 years in office, he issued about 1,700 commutations of drug offenders serving lengthy mandatory minimum terms. And of that group, about 500 were serving life without parole for a third time drug offense. So, yes, most people have committed a violent crime, but we shouldn't overlook these fairly egregious situations, even nonviolent drug crimes. So why is there a public safety argument to make about this? Well, if we look at how do people become involved in crime and things like that, the one thing that's most obvious and has been for centuries really is that crime is a young man or young woman's game, basically. So starting in the mid to late teens, the chances of getting involved in criminal activities rise pretty sharply through the early 20s or so. For most people, most demographic groups, those rates start to come down fairly quickly by the mid to late 20s and 30s, certainly by the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So we can imagine a 22-year-old who's been involved, convicted of an armed robbery, even a murder, something like that, sentenced to life imprisonment. By the time that person has been in prison 10 or 20 years, in most cases, his or her risk to public safety is dramatically lower than that 22-year-old. People grow up in prison just like we grow up on the outside. All of us can remember things we did as teenagers that we're now embarrassed about, don't like to think about, and may have been illegal in some situations, but most of us grew out of that. It's been a long time since we kept doing illegal activities, right? So what we're seeing then is that we get diminishing returns for public safety as people spend year after year in prison. And this diminishing returns comes at an increasingly greater cost because, in large part, because of rising healthcare costs. People in prison don't have very good health care to begin with, and they don't get very good health care in prison, so the aging process kicks in more quickly than it does on the outside. So if we think of our sort of public safety budget and allocation, how do we want to produce public safety? Typically, it costs about $30,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. For elderly people or people over 50 or 55, it's double that or more. So if we're spending $60,000 a year, how much public safety are we buying for that price? And what could we do about investing for the 14, 15, 16-year-olds with their families and communities, the ones who may be at risk, maybe getting involved in criminal activities themselves. So it's a question of how do we use resources when resources are finite for public safety. If we want to end mass incarceration, life imprisonment is important not only because of the 206,000 people we're looking at, but also its effect on sentences across the board. And the way this comes about is that every sentencing structure that you could see in this country or elsewhere is generally a proportional system. So murder is prosecuted, sentenced more harshly than robbery, which is prosecuted more and sentenced more so than burglary and car theft and the like. So the challenge here is that if we have a system that we have in the United States with the death penalty and life imprisonment at the top of that scale, they serve as sort of anchor points and they have an upward pressure on sentences across the board, which means that if you go to prison for car theft or burglary in the United States, you're going to spend more time in prison than if you go in England or Italy or Germany or most other industrialized nations. So we have mass incarceration both because we send more people to prison and because we keep them in prison for a longer period of time. So life imprisonment makes the whole system more punitive because of the proportional nature of how these things work out. Life imprisonment is also fundamentally violates human rights and legal standards and the like. There's no shortage of policies you can see at the European Court of Human Rights and elsewhere. Here in the United States, the American Bar Association and other legal organizations have policy statements that basically say standards punishment should be no greater than necessary to accomplish societal objectives. So if the objective is public safety, how much punishment is enough? When does it become too much punishment? When does it become problematic like that? Let me just close, and then we're happy to hear your comments. As you heard, I've been doing this work for a long time now. I started in the state of Michigan, and through a series of circumstances, I spent a lot of time in Jackson Prison, which at the time was described as the largest walled prison in the world. There were 5,000 men who were housed there. It looked like one of those grim prisons from the old Hollywood movies. It was dirty and grimy and noisy and all that. And I got to know a lot of men serving life sentences over quite a period of time. One day, I was visiting with one of them, and he asked me if I could get him the address of the organization Save the Children. I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. What do you want it for? Well, he said he was working in the prison kitchen. You don't get very much in wages in a prison, but at the end of the month, after he'd bought some things in the commissary, he still had a little money left over, and he said he wanted to send $5 a month to Save the Children. And the reason he wanted to do it was he'd been convicted of murder. He'd been in prison for more than 2 decades. He'd never had an opportunity to say he was sorry. He'd never had an opportunity to try to pay back the broader community, even in some very modest way. So do a very good job in this country of punishing people. We don't do a very good job of restoration, dealing with fundamental underlying problems and helping people to make those transformations that they need. So that's why we want to end life sentences. So we have 2 microphones here. Please come up, and if you'd like to say who you are or what your connection is or things like that, we'd like to hear that.
And any questions?
Who are you?
Greetings. I'm Nikichi Taifa. Hi, Mark. Hi, Ashley. As you know, I represent, in his clemency case, William Underwood, who's one of the features within the book, Serving a Life Without Parole sentence. We were not successful in clemency. He would not benefit under the First Step Act. He would not even have benefited under the Smarter Sentencing Act or the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. However, there was a provision within the Colton Task Force recommendations that called for a second look process because there's no parole in the federal system. I want to ask you, what do you think prospects are with respect to the recommendations for a second look that would bring into the ambit persons like William Underwood, who served 30 years in prison already and has not been able to benefit from any of the changes in the law, all of which would have impacted him if the laws had been retroactive?
Well, I can begin. No, and it's very painful, and we see that all the time. The idea is getting more traction these days, more people recognizing that, we're just overlooking any possibility of transformation. We just, at our event a few weeks ago, had a state senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Street, who's introduced legislation. Pennsylvania, every life sentence is life without parole. And he's introduced legislation that there should be a second look after 15 years of a life sentence. He's optimistic that he's got good support there. We'll see what happens. So I think the idea is percolating around. We're not terribly optimistic that Congress will take up something very soon around that, but that is obviously the way we need to be going.
I'm just somebody who didn't get caught when I was younger. And I wondered, what is the recidivism rate of the people Obama let out?
Do we know?
It's got to be zero or else we would have heard.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard anything. In general, the recidivism rate of people who are released on a life sentence is extremely low. Somewhere in the range of 5% get convicted of a new felony. So that's lower than than many other crimes. So people who are convicted of murder are typically, sometimes they're called one and done. It's a one-shot thing. People who serve life sentences, when you get to know the correctional officers that work with lifers and everything, these are described as the most docile population, the most mentoring population within the prison, that they have transformed despite the fact that there's reduced programming for them, that they're eliminated from a lot of educational opportunities because of their life sentence. So the evidence when you see lifers, either inside or outside, is that that they do transform and they don't go on to commit new crimes. There's one sort of natural experiment going on right now in Maryland. So 100 lifers were released in the last few years. It's called the Unger case. They were released because of a technicality of a case of something that happened during their particular cases in a particular range of years. So 100 lifers have been let out. There has been only one felony conviction that we're aware of since that time. So that's right in our backyard. I think people who are released on a life sentence, they consider themselves to be pretty lucky because it's not usual. Even a life with parole is very unusual to get out in a reasonable period of time.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. It sounds like a great book. My question is, one of the concerns I have is so many people in prison are there in part because they have mental health issues, and there's almost no support for them when they get out or maybe that's one of the reasons that they end up in prison. And I'm just wondering if you'd comment about the whole aspect of mental health problems in prison and on release and support for people when they get released.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a terrible problem, not just for lifers, but for people in prison in general. Mental health issues don't excuse or condone whatever criminal activity they engage in, but they do help us to understand what's going on. And the services people get in prison are minimal at best in most cases. The only glimmer of hope that there is that the practitioners themselves are increasingly aware of this in recent years, last 10 years or so, and recognizing that the system as it's set up does everyone a disservice. They're just not responding well. And, here you have police, you have defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges who don't pretend to be experts or mental health diagnosticians to understand, but, they'll say to you, there's something wrong with this guy, that sort of thing. That's the extent of what they're able to do. So in some jurisdictions, there's some movement to try to identify people where mental health is the underlying problem and try to get them on a different track, a public health track, rather than a criminal justice track. But the numbers in prison with, serious mental health issues, you can see estimates from 15% to 50% or so. And, prison environment does bad things to anyone's mental health, even if you start off pretty solid, and it's only going to get worse if you weren't in that case.
My name is Judy Lichtenberg. I teach philosophy at Georgetown and also at Jessup Prison and the DC Jail, and I'm, really impressed with your work and a big follower. I just think that for a variety of reasons, the arguments you give about public safety are very important. I think they should be augmented with the point about general deterrence and how certainty is more important than severity of sentence. But my main point is that I do think that, and I've argued this, that in the end, the only possible justification for life sentences or death sentences, given that these other arguments don't work at all, is retribution, and that it's really important to address that. So I hear you're going on The Daily Show tomorrow. I think it's important. Because I think that's, when push comes to shove and you show that all the other arguments are bogus, people say, well, people deserve it. And so I think you have to show either that the whole notion of retribution is misguided, which I sometimes believe, but I'm also a kind of judgmental person, so that doesn't come that naturally to me, or to show at least that you can deserve punishment, but not so much punishment. I just think it's important to address it, because otherwise you're going to leave a lot of people aside who say, oh yeah, well, maybe deterrence doesn't work, but it's because they deserve it that they should get these sentences.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of support behind that argument by a lot of people, and there's this reasoning that lifers aren't given programming in prison because of their life sentence, and the assumption is they're not coming out and they're not going to change. So there's no hope for redemption or hope for change. If they've committed this serious crime, there's just no way they could change. But I think, there's also sort of a more sinister conclusion, like that what you're talking about, which is that even if they do have the ability to change, they don't deserve the opportunity to change. So we're not going to give them any programming. We're not going to give them any education. We're not going to give them any opportunity to show that they can actually transform themselves. And what's so remarkable to me and to Marc, I'm sure, and to others who have actually met lifers like yourself, is that even with that, they do change. I don't know that I could go that far. I lose my mind when I can't find a parking spot, And these are people who the whole world has thrown away. And yet you go into Jessup or whatever, and you see that they're calm and obedient and learn, just engaged in study. And, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them. So I think, there is a lot that's going to have to be overcome. that's not, our book doesn't get at that too much, but we recognize that there's the victims' rights movement is a very strong movement, but the criminal justice system, the prison system, is really not designed to take care of the victims. It's designed to take care of the offender, and that's why it's called a correction system. But that's a hard argument to get by.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I worked at Fishkill on the dementia unit, and these men often had they couldn't find placement. So and Pennsylvania is a state that has justified increasing their healthcare costs within corrections, I think, in order to counter the Medicare cost of releasing them, making that kind of justifiable argument. So I'm just curious, who's doing it well, like helping the older adults exit prison and finding that kind of support? Because in New York State, many nursing homes wouldn't take them, so they were stuck there. So I'm curious about the support system for older people leaving, especially those with dementia.
It's not great. Make a long story short, in most situations, and it's not great for people who are not lifers getting out of prison too. There's been a re-entry movement developing over the last 20 years, which is encouraging, but it's still extremely modest given the scale of the problem. We see it now in recent years, as many of you know, there's been a series of Supreme Court cases on juvenile life without parole. So some reasonable numbers of people are getting out of prison, typically after 25 years or so, when they're 15, 16, 17, sentenced to prison. Where do they go then? Their family may or may not still be alive or wanting to take them in, and what do they have to show for themselves? So, here and there's some nonprofit organizations that are doing heroic work on helping them make that transition, but the correction system as a whole, there are very few places you can point to. To be fair, there are many officials in correction systems who I think genuinely would like to do more, recognize the need, and legislative bodies don't give them the resources to do that. So they make the best of what they can with that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ron Weich. Hi, Marc. One of the arguments in recent years against the death penalty has been that life without parole would be a suitable punishment for those heinous crimes that might otherwise result in capital punishment. And I guess I have two questions. One, strategically, would you worry that advocacy against life without parole would undermine the effort to abolish the death penalty? And then morally, for those unbelievably heinous crimes, the guy who shot congregants in South Carolina, or the Boston Marathon bomber, or Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City, could you imagine that it is appropriate for those crimes, if the death penalty hopefully is not available, that those individuals will be sentenced to life?
No, and we deal with that all the time, and we're firm death penalty abolitionists, but we talk with our colleagues who are in death penalty abolition organizations, and we recognize at a policy level, in some states, when death penalty is campaigned to abolish it, it probably won't happen unless the alternative is stated as life without parole. But we don't know that that's the case always the case or so, and it's partly the political environment, what we can do to begin to change that. We do know that in most cases, life without parole is not being used as an alternative to death penalty. It's being used as an alternative to life with the possibility of parole. There are about 3,000 people on death row and 50,000 serving life without parole. If we didn't have life without parole, one can't imagine all 50,000 would be on death row. So, but yes, it's challenging. We have to be in dialogue around that. Where we come out in the book and the argument we make, we call for a maximum 20-year sentence in prison, except in unusual cases. And we make that argument on the public safety grounds that most people after 20 years in prison will have a very reduced risk of criminal involvement, be good candidates for release, but then the people who present a serious threat still after 20 years, there can be some kind of extended confinement for them. And We just think it's a better way to do that, to look at the person after 20 years rather than on date of sentencing. The other part in terms of the most heinous crimes, I think, what we want to be looking at is that the most heinous crime should be punished more severely than the medium and the low severity crimes or so. So it doesn't mean, certainly we would agree, it doesn't mean they should have the death penalty, and we don't think they should necessarily have life without parole, but they should be punished or incarcerated more so than a robber, burglar, or someone else. That's pretty much the policy in Scandinavian nations and others too, where sentences of more than 20 years are almost unheard of in most cases.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Very convincing case you've made here, that's for sure. I'm sorry?
Another convert.
Oh, perhaps. Perhaps I was already there, and it's not really a
Don't
thorough.
say that.
But anyway, it occurs to me that a longer prison sentence, whether it's life with the possibility of parole, or without any possibility, or 50 years as opposed to 30 years, is something of a disincentive for this transformation process. That the longer you think you're going to be in there, if you think you're going to be there till you die, to some people that would be a disincentive to try to do anything really, rather than just lie around. And my question is, has anybody tried to measure this effect?
Well, the only thing that comes to mind, and it's pretty far back there, is a study that looked at disciplinary infractions for life without versus life with parole people in Florida.
I was going to ask that too. So.
Yeah, so that's sort of the same. He was trying to get at the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So does having no possibility of parole make you behave yourself more or less, right?
Right.
And that basically, from my memory of it, is that it's really not about that when you're getting out. It's about how old you are, and how long you've been, how much time you've had since your crime.
Right.
That it takes people who have committed a serious crime are usually pretty sick themselves. There's a lot going on in them that needs some time to heal, right? So that takes 10, 15 years. It doesn't take 60, 70 years. So when you look at the lifers, either with parole or without parole, you see that most of them have this internal transformation, within this 10 to 15 year period. I know this only from qualitative research studies that have been done that track, lifers through the process. And so it doesn't seem to have that effect where it's like, what's the use? What's the incentive to change? That incentive comes from inside for these lifers.
Let me just a couple other things on that. One is even people in the most dire circumstances in prison usually hold out some small measure of hope. Even if I have life without parole, maybe I'll be the 1 in 1,000 that the governor decides to give a commutation to. Right. So it keeps you going to some extent. The other part of it, and you hear people in prison, and the staff will tell you this too, for the lifers, this is their home. It's not a very nice home. They're very depressed about being in this home, but this is their home. So it's in their interest to make it as calm and reasonable environment as possible. The prison guards will always tell you, well, these young kids who come in, they're just going to be here a couple of years, and they just came in from the streets, and, they're just very hard to control, whereas the lifers are the stable influences and all that. So that helps in that.
Thanks.
All right, 2 quick questions. One is, could you talk a little bit about the most recent prison reform effort in Congress that I think was led by Jared Kushner? And the second question is, to what extent are the financial costs of long-term incarceration creating partnerships for this movement? Is that a real thing? Are there conservative politicians out there that are partners with you around that issue?
It's very complicated. We've been very engaged on Capitol Hill. Our Strategic Advocacy Director Karagaj is one of the key players who helped make all that legislation possible. We're very encouraged that the legislation passed. It was passed in a bipartisan way. It will make a difference in the lives of thousands of people in prison. They'll have some excessive time removed from their sentences. At the same time, it's an exceedingly modest bill given the scale of the problem we're talking about and some of the compromises that were made in getting the legislation through. For example, things like the 3 strikes and you're out drug life sentence. Going forward from now, it'll be, quote, only 25 years mandatory minimum. So that's still better than life. But originally, it would have been retroactive and applied to hundreds of people in prison rather than just a few dozen a year who are newly sentenced. Jared Kushner was very involved, and the story is, he's concerned because his father went to prison on some financial stuff. There's been in the last decade, people on the right have increasingly spoken out on these issues. So Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, write op-ed articles and saying we're wasting our money and there are better ways to do things and all that. So it's been helpful in opening some doors on Capitol Hill and state legislative bodies as well. I personally don't think that the financial argument gets us that far. If people are fearful, people don't see any alternatives. They're willing to spend money if they think it's going to keep them safe. The analogy I always think of is, the Cold War that went on for 50 years in the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Cold War, by any fiscal argument, was crazy, irrational, illogical, but as long as there was this fear, political leaders and many people in the public were willing to pay for it. So it has to be a moral argument. It has to be a practical argument. We have to talk about doing things better. And yes, the fiscal argument is part of that, but I guess not the lead argument in my mind.
Some of the, in one state, in Oklahoma, there was a bill that was introduced and made it pretty far a few years ago about the elderly prisoners. So not lifers, just people over the age of 55. In prison, you become elderly sooner, so don't take offense, anyone. The idea was to give people who had served, I think, 15 years or more, or they were 55 and older, a chance at parole sooner. But at the last minute, as is usually the case, they excluded lifers, which was pretty much everybody who was 55 and older. So it ended up like, it didn't pass, but it would have, if it had passed, it would have helped like 8 people. And that's unfortunately how this goes a lot of times, is that at the very end, the bargaining chip is the lifers, either when it comes to the, sort of broader criminal justice reform or the death penalty reform. It's like on either side, everyone's willing to sacrifice the lifers, because don't worry, we're going to keep the lifers in. So that, in order to really dismantle mass incarceration, we argue, we're going to have to break that apart.
Hi, I'm Jenny Roberts. I teach a criminal justice clinic at American, so I deal with misdemeanors, so thanks for taking me out of that world for a minute. I was actually going to ask about the fiscal, sort of the purchase it has, but maybe you can speak a little bit more to in the state legislatures that have considered some reforms, whether the sort of buying, how much public safety are you buying, which is a great way to put it, if that's been on the table a lot, because it certainly has been for expungement legislation. When I've seen or testified at hearings on that end of things, that's been really important. How much more tax base are you going to get, and how much more job opportunity will there be? And related to that, I really want to go back to the excellent point about the really strong retributivist streak in this country, and how do you answer that? I want to push you a little further on that, because I do think I ask when I teach first year criminal law, I ask my students, what do you think the appropriate sentences for this, this, and this? And it's been kind of all over the place. I've only taught it a few years, but it's not always what I would expect. They're not all as punitive as I would think on some things, and they're more punitive on other things. And so what's the baseline? How do you start a conversation about, it's not enough to say in Europe they do this, because everyone just poo-poos that. But it's so off the charts. So are there studies? Has there been public polling about what people would actually like to see? Because we all know that sentencing law isn't made by legislators who are actually carrying out what people rationally think the sentence should be.
Well, I think first on the fiscal argument, yes, at the state level, the fiscal argument I think works more effectively than it does in Congress. In part because the corrections budget is a very big hit in the state budget, where it's a lot of money at the federal level, but it's pretty trivial overall and stuff. So it's not going to move them completely. I think there are some reasons to be modestly optimistic about the ability of people to be open-minded, and I think part of it is, how we or policymakers frame the discussion. I've looked at a lot of public opinion research on these issues over the years, and basically, if you say to people, do you think we should get tough on criminals, mandatory sentencing will keep them in prison, and, let's take away all the frills in prison and stuff like that, 3/4 of the public says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. If you say, do you think that crime is often related to poverty and poor education and lack of opportunity, 3/4 of the people say yes to that also. So, the problem is it used to be more so in the 80s and 90s, political campaigns, the candidates only asked the first set of questions, not the second one. So we didn't get very far. They didn't get very far. In the last 20 years, the movement towards reentry, which is a very simple concept. It's what we used to call rehabilitation. That became a dirty word. We couldn't say it for 20 years and got reinvented as reentry. But it appeals to both liberals and conservatives. Whether you think there are too many people in prison or not enough people in prison, it should be in everyone's interest that when people come home from prison, they're better prepared to make it. And, the conservatives, the correction system has bought into that, certainly. I think also restorative justice. It's not about to take over the system as it is, but it's become widely accepted, at least at some level within the justice system, within communities, because it's a positive approach. It speaks to the needs of victims. It speaks to healing in ways that the adversary system in the courts was never set up to do. So I think there's some potential there, and we're seeing the environment little by little start to shift and be a little more receptive to some of these other approaches now, that sort of thing.
You have time for one more question. So this has to do with the impact of religion on sentencing and reform. So it seems like in Christianity, at least, there's two wings. There's the eye for eye kind of feeling, and then there's the conversion. I've become born again. I'm a new person. The kind of Chuck Colson experience from Watergate. So to what extent do those religious experiences ever impact these people in terms of getting out? Is it convincing to anyone? What's your experience?
I can talk about Centoya Brown. You're talking about the people who are serving, right? Not the people who are changing laws. Yeah, the people who are serving, a lot of them do get involved in, studies of personal transformation, usually, religious groups. She got very involved in the Baptist church in the prison system, and she attributes, all of this to, her having turned her life over, to God. And so there's been, the lifers who I know, which is a small percentage of the total lifers, the ones who have come out, a lot of them have converted to a formal religion while they were incarcerated, and they see that as sort of their anchor in life. I don't know that there's been any empirical work on that, but of the ones I know, a lot of them have a real sort of spiritual guidance in their life. You look like you have a question.
I just want to say that that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth comes from the Code of Hammurabi, not from Christian doctrine. It is mentioned in the Bible, but it's in the context of refuting that as a Christian philosophy. It's in the same passage with turn the other cheek. So Matthew speaks about it, but not to endorse the concept.
We're going to add that to the website. This is the last one.
Okay. So I'm Joy Markowitz. I'm just a general interested citizen. I'm wondering if, acknowledging that there's not sufficient programming for reentry, if you two were approached, what criteria would you use to make judgments about who's ready to reenter now, considering the state that we're in, which is maybe a sorry state? What would you advise people to look at in terms of those lifers who are in there?
Well, I mean, that gets at the issue of our parole boards really needing a complete revamping, which is another section of our book that, we talk about how they've really become sort of entrenched in politics and all that. And that we make the argument that people who are the decision makers about who's ready to come out would be those who have, some psychology background, some people who are involved in the prison system, who have, take the input of the correctional officers who have worked with the prisoners over the years, rather than what's normally happens, which is that they look at the crime of conviction and they see what kinds of support and opposition there is to their release. So we would advocate, I'm sure we would be the first to say we're not in a position to decide who gets to come and who gets to leave, but we would advocate for, there being true experts that are, able to make those kinds of decisions, that have social work and psychological and behavioral, expertise.
Well, with that, let me just close by saying, in case you didn't notice, we've also started a campaign to end life imprisonment. We've got a website and social media and lots of other stuff, and we're launching this as a public education and advocacy campaign to try to get the ideas that we promote in the book out in the public and engage in conversations with policymakers about, what is the scale of punishment in the United States and how do we begin to reshape the conversation. So that's what we're trying to do, and check it out. And thanks so much for coming, everybody.